And that plugs into your computer, you say?
I love you so much. Yes, by USB. Okay, hello, welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for people who like to chat books. Today it's me, Sarah, and I am coming to you, as always, from the Netherlands, and today I'm very happy to be joined by a wonderful special guest. I have Kate here from Book Club Review Podcast, who is joining me from London.
Hi, so happy to be here.
Nice to have you on. We met each other in real life, was it last week or the week before? I can't even remember. I came to London.
Yeah, feels like a lifetime ago. No, it was just last week, I think.
Yeah, and you took me to a canal boat and we had lunch together.
The Book Barge. Yeah, it's a fantastic little floating bookshop, which I think you'll agree, they have a really good edit, don't they? You never quite know what you're going to find there, but it's always something good.
Had the most interesting mix. I always look at organisation in bookshops, because you have in London you have Daunt Books, for example, which is done by region, right? I always find that pretty interesting. But this was just not alphabetical, not era, not genre. It was, I don't know what it was.
It's an eclectic mix, and it's also a mixture of secondhand and new titles. Yeah, it's a bit odd, but I love that it's very them. It's very personal to them, and I often think my favourite bookshops are the ones where they have a real personality to them. You know, they're quite distinct. It's not quite like anywhere else. So the Book Barge, it's called Words on the Water, and it's quite special, I think.
So, super happy to have you on the pod. Thanks for coming on. You have your own podcast, which is wonderful. I think people who listen to this probably already know about it, but if not, would you like to describe it to us?
It's called the Book Club Review Podcast. It's a books podcast, but we are trying to focus on coming at it through the lens of book clubs. So my co-host Laura and I each have our own book clubs, and we cover the books that our book clubs choose to read. And in the episodes, Laura and I also each read each other's book club books. And in the episodes, we talk about that book, but we also draw in then the range of opinions that our book club have. Because what we really love and what we felt was missing from a lot of the shows that we were listening to when we first started, was just that element of debate and honesty about how people really felt about books. We love that critical debate. We love that exchange of ideas. We love those really polarized opinions where some people really hate a book and some people really love it. And then that discussion and everything in between. And that's what really energizes us, and we really love it. That's why we love our book clubs. And we wanted to try and bring some of the spirit of that to a podcast.
I wanted to do an episode about book clubs. I also am in a book club, and I thought, I know just the person. The book club expert is Kate. My book club has read a couple of books that you have recommended for book clubs. I think you've done a couple of episodes where you, which I'll link in the show notes actually, where you specifically talk about really good books for book club. And one of them, I was like, great, that's my job done for my book club, choosing the books. And it worked very well. So you definitely know what you're talking about.
Well, when we started, we were more focused on the mechanics of book club and the idea of book club. And we actually used to interview lots and lots of different book clubs. We interviewed a man who runs the Proust book club in Paris, where they only read things either by Proust or about Proust. We interviewed someone who runs a horror book club here in London, where they only are doing that genre. And that was amazing. That was such an interesting experience talking to him, because horror is not a genre that Laura and I go near. We're such scaredy cats. But that was really fascinating. And everything in between, we talked to a lesbian book club. We talked to a walking book club. Our friend Emily, who takes a group of people for walks on Hampstead Heath, and they discuss books. And we were really fascinated by just all the different possible ways that you can have a book club, and continue to be, actually. I just think it's such an interesting idea to me, because ultimately at heart it's about getting people together to talk about books. And that never gets boring.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think I didn't join to discuss books. I joined because I wanted to meet people in my city. So I joined the book club that I'm in is one that I joined when I moved to the city that I live in now from Australia. So I live in the Netherlands now. And I was like, how can I meet people that aren't, who I don't work with, that are slightly like me? I'm like, oh, I'll join a book club. And it worked out perfectly. Some of my absolute best friends here are people I met through the book club. So did you start your own book club? What's the story?
I was in a book club run by a friend who I worked with, which was a really well-established, long-running book club that she did with her group of university friends, so very old, very dear friends. And it was a brilliant book club. They just had a knack for choosing really great books, and the discussions were always really good because they were just sort of bright and articulate and really fun. And after I'd been in that one for a while, I sort of started to feel like I just really wanted to have more of a role in organising it and almost just having my own book club. I loved being in that one, but it didn't feel like mine. And also I only knew my friend. I didn't know the others so well. And they were such a kind of group already. Even though I was totally welcome there, I always felt a little bit of an outsider. And so, yeah, then I just decided to start my own book club, and gradually, you meet people, you have a conversation with them about books. Next thing you're like, oh, I have a book club. Would you like to come along? And so it evolved from there, really. And Laura's, I think, was fairly similar. She lived in London for many years, and so her book club are here in London, but she's now moved back to Vancouver. She moved back there during lockdown, which is where she's from. And very sweetly, she's been able to keep going with her book club thanks to Zoom and thanks to the fact that we're all used to doing that now. And so that's, for her, a regular point of contact and connection with all her London friends, which I know is really important to her. Plus, we still have our source of opinions for the podcast.
So Laura doesn't have a new book club in Vancouver as of yet?
She does. She's getting a bit stretched these days because she also now has a Vancouver book club who seek out not super challenging books, but they're certainly not going for easy reads. So she's in her London book club, her Vancouver book club, and technically she's ideally would read for my book club as well, in that we try and read each other's books.
Okay, God. And you have a podcast, so you have to read for the podcast.
Well, so the podcast reading, I suppose, yes, you're right, in fact, because often we're doing other things on the podcast as well. We do these shows called Bookshelf, where we do just books that we've been reading outside of book club. Yes, it's true. It's a lot of reading.
Yeah, I'm thinking of you like you do prize episodes like we do and that kind of thing. Although you guys are kind of smart. Well, you're very smart. I won't say kind of smart. You are smart in that you split the list. Whenever I listen to one, I'm like, God damn, what am I doing?
I think if you love to read, it is fun to read all the books on a short list and then have a really informed opinion about the winner. And ultimately, that is just going to benefit you because you're going to read 6 really amazing books instead of 1. But I don't think it's really sustainable. That's the trouble. And there are so many amazing prizes, and, it gets a bit frustrating. You can't read for all of them. You just can't. Even reading for 1, it's a bit of a mission. So, yeah, I think trying to figure out ways of making it so that we can still do it. And gradually over time, you start to evolve strategies for doing that. And we're, much like you, we're trying to fit in all of this around our lives. I've got 3 children and just lots going on at home all the time, and Laura's got quite a busy and demanding day job, so it's always just what we can squeeze in on the margins.
Between the 4 of us, the 4 hosts that we have, we're always very conscious of losing the magic and spontaneity of reading. I just want to be able to pick up a book and not be thinking okay, what would I say about this on the podcast? What are the points? What's the summary? This can take the joy out of it a lot. So this is something we really try and keep in mind when we're planning episodes. So you choose the books for your own book club, is that right?
I don't choose them. In my book club, we have a system where we talk about the book that we've just been discussing. We have a really good time discussing that. And then at the end, usually as a bit of an afterthought, it's what should we read next? And people throw in suggestions. And
really?
The only, sort of control that I exert in a way is I just would try to make sure that it's not always the same person who gets their book chosen, and that generally, it switches around. That said, I started to feel a bit frustrated with that process of choosing books because it just felt like it wasn't really very considered, and that we would end up reading things that were just picked really as an afterthought. And so this year, what we've been doing is we've been following a series of prompts that I got from another book podcast that I really love, which is called the Bookstore podcast. It's these 2 American girls, Becca and Corinne, who are great. I really recommend that show. And their thing was that they both used to work in a bookshop. And again, it's got that really nice book club vibe. They don't always like everything they talk about. It's always a good back and forth of ideas and really good. In order to choose the books that they read for their show, they've got this series of prompts. So every month there's a different idea and then they're picking from that. And I just think it leads to some interesting choices, and I like the way that it nudges you to slightly broaden your selection in a way, the books that you're looking at, and maybe nudge you out of your comfort zone. Now, book club for me, the thing I love about it is it gets me to read things that I wouldn't necessarily choose to read for myself. But even within book club, given that we're all friends who have a more or less similar taste in books, I find that gradually even book club has started to become something where I'm generally reading things that I probably would be reading anyway. And so I love the way that this kind of nudges all of us to kind of look slightly outside of our reading comfort zones. So some examples are, a book from an independent press, or a backlist title by an author whose work you love. We liked a book that you've had on your shelves for a while that you've always meant to read but never got round to. We did a book from the year of your birth. And then we've got a WhatsApp chat. So once we decide what the category is going to be or what the prompt's going to be, then we post suggestions on the WhatsApp. And then when we come to the book club, there's already a pool of great suggestions that we've all had a little look at. And then it's quite then an easy process to decide.
But you decide it month to month?
Yes, as we go along. But I've talked to book clubs. Laura's mother's book club, for instance, have this thing I always think sounds absolutely lovely, where at the beginning of every year, they get together, they have this lovely brunch, and they sit down and they pick books for the whole year in this glorious, lovely kind of meeting that they must have, which I think must be the most fun. And then they know, you would like this, I feel, Sarah, actually. I feel like this would appeal to you. I like things to be organised. They know then, they've done all their choosing in advance, and all they have to do then is just work their way through them and not think about that aspect of it, which also is quite good, because then it frees you up for what you're really there to do, which is just talk about the book.
Yeah, that's what my book club used to do. We basically did what you're talking about with people throwing out ideas, but we would do it like every 6 or 7 months. I run my book club newly, so when I joined, I didn't run it, but then the person who did run it has now left. And actually the person who did run it is Christine, who has guested on the Bookcast Club before. So now I run it, and I've sort of been doing this thing for the past 12 months, which I don't know if they like or not, because we're going to talk about how the last 12 months have been in the next meeting that we have. So I probably should have waited until after we did this discussion to do this episode recording. But anyway, what we actually do is that it's kind of a combination of what you've just been saying. I decide a series of topics that we're going to read, right? For example, let's read a book that is set in the Caribbean. Let's read a historical fiction. Let's read a campus novel, etc. And then I create a little short list of about 3 or 4 books, and then they can vote for which one they want to choose. And I create the list just essentially because I listen to so many podcasts and I'm so familiar with what is kind of liked, what kind of books I think would make a good discussion, and I put those on there, and then they get to choose which one they get to choose, she says.
Oh, that's really interesting. I would be so curious to know whether they like that or not.
If they complain about the book, I'm like, well, you guys chose it. If only you'd chosen one of the other ones on my list.
Yeah, but they didn't really, because you gave them a pre-selected choice. So that's an interesting question. How much free choice did they really have?
Yeah, it's controlled democracy. I'm aware of that. But often, though, a lot of people wanted to read Entangled Life, for example. So sometimes I just put that on there. Or if there's a couple of things that people are mentioning that they'd like to read, I just put them on there as well. So I'm very open to suggestions, actually, even though I'm not making it sound like I am. So for example, we did in May, we did campus novels was the thing that I chose. So I put in Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi, because we'd read Homegoing sometime before and everyone had loved it. So I put that on, put Real Life on by Brandon Taylor, and I think The Idiot by Elif Batuman. Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that I will do, and they just get to choose. They get to choose. That's the language I'm using. They're allowed to choose what they would like to read. And we did Australia last month, for example, and we chose from the, I think, a Tara Jean Winch, I think, and there was a Charlotte Wood on there, and The White Girl by Tony Birch is the one that they read in the end. So
how interesting. I kind of love the idea of that. Also, I think, everyone is busy, aren't they? And book club is usually extra reading on top of all the reading that you're just doing for yourself, assuming everyone in your book club are just readers. So book club is always, by its very nature, a book that you're trying to fit in around everything else. And I think, therefore, if you're asking people to carve out space for it, you do want it to be a bit of a considered choice. You don't want to just randomly pick something and waste a month and make everyone read something that, maybe isn't such a good book club book, something that they're not really going to get something from, or it's not going to lead to a really interesting discussion. And it's true, the best way to avoid doing that is to think about it carefully beforehand.
Yeah, I sort of try and choose books that I listen to, the podcasts that I listen to when they talk about them. So like your podcast is a good example. Also Books on the Go, that podcast. If it's a book that one host is like, oh, I really liked it, and the other person is like, oh, I disagree, that's kind of a thing for me that makes me think it would be a good one for a book club. Because if everyone likes it or doesn't like it, that's not a good choice, in my opinion.
Yeah, so strangely, Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, which my friend Natalie in my book club proposed for us, because I think we'd just been through a run of reading things that were quite hard-hitting and intense, and she just wanted something, just kind of an easy read. So she flagged it up, and I think we were all in the mood, so we're like, yeah, great. And we were kind of curious, what is this book that's been such a phenomenal bestseller? Let's find out. Anyway, I read that book and just thought to myself, oh, pleasant read. I'm not sure we're going to have that much to talk about. What can you say? Got to my book club and oh my goodness, did we have a good discussion about that book, because it turned out it was a real 50-50 split, and it's a very polarizing read, and people have all kinds of things to say about it and how they felt about it. And so it made for surprisingly to me, it actually made for a really good, really fun book club discussion. And I thought, yeah, it's books that divide people and hopefully are good and fun to read.
Yep, totally. I also find that books that bring up a lot of the best discussions that we've had in our book club have been books that prompt a kind of more general discussion about something, like the experience of the character prompts people to share like personal experiences of theirs. Or in my book club, we have a very big mix of people from different walks of life who've have had all sorts of different experiences and lived in all different countries. So if we can get a book that allows people, that sort of gives people an opportunity to share things that have happened to them or experiences that they've had, they're always the best discussions, for sure. So I try and sort of choose books that are kind of a jumping off point rather than books that are super plot focused. I find are not that good for a discussion, like a crime novel, for example. If you're reading it, you're like, oh, I thought it was this person, but then I thought it was that person. Maybe it's me, but I don't find those discussions like particularly fruitful or interesting or fulfilling.
Yeah, I was thinking, the best book club books are like onions, right? Mm-hmm. It's all about the layers, and it can be a short book, it can be a long book, it can be, any different kind of book. But the thing I think that really lends itself to being a good book club book is how many layers are there? How deep can you go? I've just finished The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki, which just won the Women's Prize here in the UK. And it's really long, which makes me question whether it would be good for a book club. I don't think it would really work for my book club, for example, who are all busy people, just would struggle to get through something really, really long. But in terms of the layers, I thought it's fantastic. There is so much going on, and on the one hand, you've got this really great plotty story and this brilliant relationship between this mother and this son. And then you've got all kinds of different things going on to do with metatextuality and the idea of book as object and the writer and all these kind of playful things that she's doing. And then you've got the idea of mental illness, and she's exploring that and our society's relationships with possessions and consumer culture, and she's restoring that. And it's so rich and full of things that you would, I think, need, even just one book club session, you wouldn't get through it all. And that's the thing. You're not going to run out of things to talk about from a book like that.
Maybe you could do it in a 2-half sort of thing, if your book club's up for that kind of thing. First half and second half, over 2 different meetings. Maybe that's what I would do. Because it's 600 pages or so, right? It's quite a...
Yeah, hefty... It's like 554.
Not that you were counting. I want to ask you, actually, if you have any rules about books. Because I have some sort of mental rules that I use when I'm choosing books. And one of them is page limit, because I've noticed with my book club, also people that work full-time and all that kind of thing, everyone seems to read sort of a maximum of 350 pages or 400 pages, and that's regardless of how long the book is. So if it's a 300-page book, everyone finishes it. If it's a 500-page book, everyone's like, I'm nearly finished. 700 pages, people are like, oh, I'm halfway. So I was like, okay, so obviously we're reading 300 pages a month regardless, so I'll just make sure the books are sort of sub 350, which I also find is kind of better for reading that you have to do anyway. Because it's not sort of this big thing that's like hanging around. You're like, oh, I've only got 4 weeks to do that. Whereas if it's a sort of a 2-day job, I find that it's a lot more fun.
Yeah, I think it's about knowing your book club, isn't it? I mean, my mother-in-law's book club are what I think of as a very intellectually driven book club. These are all people who've had busy, successful careers. They're writers, they're journalists, they're authors, they're quite a literary lot. Now they're retired and they've got time on their hands, and they are just really thirsty for kind of big, demanding books that I would find really daunting. There's a real appetite. They want to read those books, although my mother does sometimes complain quietly that she wants to do something that's just a bit readable.
What kind of things do they read? Can you think of any?
They did Life and Fate, Vasily Grossman, written in 1959, only published in the West in 1980. The second half of the author's conceived two-part book under the same title. Critique of Stalinism. And Phil, Laura's friend Phil, who is a really treasured guest on our podcast. I absolutely love. He's so great, isn't he? He seeks out intellectually demanding books, and he's in another book club, not Laura's book club, but a different book club where that is their remit. They want books that are going to challenge them and push them, and it just depends what your book club what you want to get out of it. And I love that about him. We did when I first met him, actually, he came on to talk to us about that particular book club. And they were reading books like Compass by Matthias Einard, Fitzcarraldo. I feel like it's a lot of Fitzcarraldo-y stuff, if that tells you anything. But I love that. I aspire to that. Practically speaking, in my life, I don't do that kind of reading very often, but I always want to be the kind of person who does do that reading. And if a book club was going to make me do that, I would quite like that idea. Whereas my mum's book club, which is my parent friend's book club, I call my mum's book club, so it's my mum friend's book club. These are people at probably the busiest stage of their lives, where they're trying to juggle family life, children, and usually working as well, and everything is squeezed in on the margins. And for that book club, when we first started it, it was kind of a problem because books kept being suggested and people just weren't getting through them. And recently, I feel like there's been a kind of sort of tacit acknowledgement of that, and reading slightly shorter books, going for books that we know are going to be very readable. And as a result, I don't think people have any more time to fit them in. I think it's still a real struggle. But if you're doing something short, you can just read it the day before and still get to book club and then have this really lovely life-enhancing meeting and discussion about something that isn't to do with family life and it isn't to do with work, and it's a real escape. So it's about, different strategies, knowing your book club and knowing the books that are going to work for that particular group of people, so that everyone gets what they want to. Everyone gets what they want to out of book club.
Exactly. So my book club, for a bit more context, it's an English language book club in a non-English speaking country. So it's full of like expats and people who are all busy. A lot of them are academic, all stressed about visas and moving and like the rules. And a lot of people join when they've first moved to the city. So it's just not quite the place. It wouldn't quite be the forum for people to have that kind of discussion. Yeah, that is important. You've got to sort of listen to what people are wanting and what books go down really well, I think, for sure.
I've always really loved the idea of a poetry book club. And when we were... Yeah, I just think... Because do you read poetry?
No.
No, and neither do I. I haven't read any poetry since school. But do you not suspect sometimes, do you not think we might be missing out on something that's incredibly rich and powerful and important and really would add a whole other cultural layer to our lives, and we don't know because we're not reading it. And but I'm not going to read it left to my own devices, I'm going to be honest here. So, a little book club that was just nudging me to read a poem every month. And I did think, if you're busy, that might be a really nice thing to do.
I mean, it would be quick, that's for sure, because it's kind of you read the poem, but you've got to think about it, which you can multitask, I guess.
Exactly.
So you can think about it while you're chopping your vegetables.
My suspicion is that I think you would end up reading things that resonated with you, that changed you, that gave you different ways of interacting with the world. All of that stuff you get from poetry, and it's extraordinary, and just a few lines on a page, so reading time, it's great.
Well, don't you have a book club now with your podcast? Kate just gave me a look.
Do you mean my Instagram book club?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very much I'm like an ideas girl. I'm a creative person, really. I'm all about the ideas and dreaming up new things. Laura constantly is grumbling at me about this because then I'm a novelty merchant, and I love dreaming up the new things. I get all excited about them. And then when it comes to actually sticking with things and executing them, I get a bit restless. I'm like, oh, yeah. Anyway, I can't remember what impulse it was, but I just thought, it'd be so great to do an online Instagram book club. It could be the podcast book club. Brilliant. Actually, none of that intrinsically a bad idea. I still think it would be really, really wonderful. Agree. But what was the problem then with my Instagram book club? What was the main hurdle would you say that I stumbled at, given that we're talking about book selection?
Oh, yeah, so you chose a 700-page book that had just won the Booker.
There you go. So, yeah, the Booker International Prize I'm really interested in. Always try to read some of the books on that shortlist. I think it's so great for flagging up really interesting books. But the book that won this year was Tomb of Sand by an Indian author called Gitanjali Shri, who wrote the book in Hindi, and it was translated into English by Daisy Rockwell. I, in my defence, didn't actually know when I blithely picked it for the first book club that it was 750 pages long. And it was only when I saw it in the bookshop the next day, I picked it up. I was like, oh.
Holy shit.
750 pages of really dense type. But, I'd already announced it, so then it became a series of fairly excruciating confessional videos on Sunday nights for about a month, where I just was like basically a string of excuses for why I hadn't managed to finish Tomb of Sand. Although I am, actually working through it. And I would say to anyone considering reading it, it's a really great book that I absolutely would recommend. I think it's beautifully written, really not quite like anything else I've read. So much about it that I love. And yeah, definitely, recommended, but was not the right choice for the first Instagram book club. And I don't know if there are any people out there who were keen or enthusiastic to join in, because what must they be thinking of me? It's just pretty hopeless.
I said I've already read it, so I said I would join. But then I think I sent you a message on Instagram, and I was like, "So what date is this?" And you're like, "Oh, I don't know. Don't ask me these questions."
I know, because then we came crashing into Women's Prize. Just finished the Ozeki for that, and then I'm away for much of the summer because it's the school holidays. So I'm feeling very shamefaced about Tomb of Sand because I don't think we're really going to be able to talk about it until September. Apropos of this discussion about choosing your book club books, don't be like me. Think it through. Think, okay, how much time do I really have this month? Am I going to be able to read a 750-page novel? And are other people likely to want to read that along with me? And if the answer to those questions is yes, then go for it.
I think, honestly, Kate, if people can hit some kind of happy medium between you and me, they'll be absolutely away. They'll be sailing. That's all you need. Okay, this is where we take a little break to tell you all about the different ways that you can support the podcast, some of which are totally free. A really effective and easy way of showing your support is by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. There is a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the Apple Podcast page where you can write a review. And if you listen on Spotify, you can now very easily give us a star rating. You can also share our posts on social media, which really, really helps us. We are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter. We also have a free monthly newsletter that you can sign up for if you like, where we share even more book recommendations and all the latest podcast news. But the best way for us to find new listeners is by you telling your book-loving friends and family about us. If you want to support the podcast financially, which really helps, it's not free to run this podcast, then we also have a Patreon account. You can sign up for as little as £2 a month. We offer early access to the podcast, monthly bonus episodes, and our highest tier will get you both of those things and also personalised book recommendations. We just get you to fill in a survey and then we tailor our book recommendations to your preferences. We also send you those books in the post sometimes. There are over 15 bonus episodes that you can get instant access to if you sign up as a Patreon today. The link is in our show notes. But however you choose to support us, we want to say a huge thank you. We really appreciate each and every one of our listeners. Let's make some suggestions for people if they're looking for book club books. Shall we?
Let's. I mean, the hard thing is narrowing it down, isn't it?
How many have you got?
Well, that's the thing. That is the thing. I just couldn't choose, and I was like, this is crazy. I run a podcast about book club books, but the reason is because there are so many, and it's like, well, what would be the best almost sort of general ones that I feel are just surefire? So I've got 3, tried and tested. They worked really well for my book club. A couple of them we talked about on the podcast, made for good episodes, and I just think are generally life-enhancing reads. Okay,
cool. And we will link the episodes that you talked about these books in your podcast in the show notes so people can hear further information if they'd like. But wicked. Okay, so what's your first one?
My first one is a book called I Was Amelia Earhart, and it's by an author called Jane Mendelsohn, published in 1997. This one was recommended to me by bibliotherapist and book recommending queen, Ella Bertude. Ella Bertude, if listeners don't know, she and Susan Elderkin are bibliotherapists. They will sit you down, they will talk to you about what's going on in your life, they'll think really hard about it, and then they will give you a prescription of books to help you get through whatever it is that you're going through in that moment in your life, or just, books that will really proactively maybe work on you or change you or help you get through something. So it's not just about reading a good book. It's not just about recommending a good book. There's a lot more thought that goes into it. They actually then, brilliantly, for all of us and people who can't necessarily afford to go and sit down at the School of Life and do this thing in person, they wrote this wonderful book. This book is my absolute touchstone. It's my Bible. I have it near me almost at all times. I love it so much. It's called The Novel Cure, an A to Z of literary remedies. In it, they've basically packaged up all of their genius recommendations, and everything is listed under ailments, various different ailments that you might be experiencing. So I've just opened it at random, and they've put nose, hating your. So you hate your nose. All noses are pretty weird if you gaze at them long enough. Some are big, some are dainty, some are ski jumps, some are craggy outcrops complete with craters, but none, we can probably agree, are particularly lovely. And so it goes on. And then the recommendation they've got for that is a novel called Perfume by Patrick Suskind, which is a really interesting book.
That's a German book, isn't it?
Is it?
I believe so. I think it's sort of a German classic.
Yeah, that's funny, because I remember it did really well here, and I read it sort of when everyone was reading it, and I hadn't clocked that it was actually a book in translation.
It's an amazing book. It's absolutely enormous. It looks so cool. Beautiful hardback as well.
It's so wonderful, and it's so rich, and I just did want to flag it up because I think another thing that you can do when you're thinking about, good books to recommend is have a book like this. Well, there is no other book like this. Have this book. And flip through, and you're going to find lots of inspiration, sort of tried and tested things that they're recommending that are going to, I feel every book in here meets those criteria of it's going to be really interesting, it's going to have lots of layers, it's going to be life enhancing, it's going to provoke good discussion and debate, which is what you want. Anyway, the reason I mention that is because my book club once went on a reading retreat, and I got in touch with Susan and Ella and asked them if they could recommend a book. Didn't want to get there, and read the wrong book. So I got in touch with them to ask them if they could recommend a book. And they recommended I Was Amelia Earhart. It's quite short. It's pleasingly short. It is 150 pages.
Oh, nice.
And it's fiction, but it's based around the story of real-life aviatrix Amelia Earhart, who famously we know didn't make it around the world on her epic flight that she was trying to do. She crashed, and no one knows exactly what happened to her and her navigator, this Irish man called Noonan. And so this book explores that story. It's written in quite an interesting way, and that in itself I think is something that's good to discuss. The way she executes the story that she wanted to tell. It's also one of those brilliant books because you sort of feel like you're reading a story, it's one thing, and actually by the end you realise that it's really about something else, and that something else is something really wonderful to consider. So it really takes you somewhere, and I love that about it. It's delightful in the way that it plays with what we really know about what happened and what might have happened, the could have beens, the possibilities. It's really fun and exciting. And then, for example, when the book Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead was published, and that was on our radar, it was shortlisted for various prizes, wasn't it? So we read it for the podcast and loved that book. But if you enjoyed Great Circle and that idea of these amazing women who were sort of flying around, this book absolutely fed into that and really informed my reading of that book in a way that I absolutely loved. And it made for a brilliant discussion book. I remember we all sat around the long table in France. We went to France for this away weekend, and it was just the nicest time. And this book was a brilliant discussion book that I remember very fondly to this day. It did not please everybody, and that was what was good about it.
Nice. Please everybody, but still have a good discussion, because sometimes the ones where people are like, oh, I really liked it, doesn't really go anywhere. So yeah, the 3 books that I've chosen are also ones that I chose because I remember the discussion was really, really good, and it was just really meaty. There was a lot of things to discuss. So my first one is Patsy by Nicole Dennis Benn, which is set, which we read because it was a Caribbean month in my world where I decide these themes. And Patsy is about a woman who is living in Jamaica, but then she migrates to the US, and it's a very, very interesting read because her reasons for moving are quite imperfect, and she's someone who is, of course, she's a marginalized woman, so it's hard for her to live in the US, it's hard for her to live in Jamaica because she's queer as well, but she's a very imperfect character, and her decisions are very imperfect, and they affect other people in a very negative way. So she also has children, and her decisions are not amazing in terms of how it ends up for her children. And so it's a really interesting book because she's such a complicated character and you feel for her, but at the same time you're so frustrated for her decisions and why she made them. And I remember we ended up having the most interesting discussion in our book club about motherhood and your obligations as a parent and the idea of moving, and because almost everyone in my book club has moved to a different country, what that does to the people you leave behind and those decisions and how impossible they are. And once you move, how you're sort of living in two places but not entirely in one place ever again, and it's so complicated and you know, everything's so messy from that point on. And it also wasn't super depressing. It was just a really, really interesting discussion about decisions that don't have a right or wrong answer at the end of the day. It was really, really good.
That sounds good. I've never heard of that one.
She also wrote Here Comes the Sun, which was a slightly bigger book. Bigger as in made more of a splash. And this was her earlier book, I think. So yeah, I really, really recommend that for a discussion.
Sounds great. Well, my second one is, I feel like, reasonably out there, but only because they made a film of it. Well, they made a film of one of the stories of it. So it's called Stories of Your Life and Others by an American author called Ted Chiang. What I love about him is that he works at Microsoft, I think, or somewhere as a computer programmer or some kind of really high-level computer person. But on the side, he writes these short stories, and he's not just good at it, he's unbelievably amazing at it. These stories are like nothing else you have ever read. If you just read one of the whole collection, you're going to have a really good sense of him. They're so good that in practice what happened was that, you know, even my book club, who are a bit busy, read all of them. But there's one story in the middle, which is Story of Your Life, which is the story that they then made into the film Arrival with Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner, I think.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't seen that film, but I read this story and it is so incredible. It's just the most wonderful piece of writing. When we talked about this book on the podcast, we spent the whole hour basically talking about this one story, which made us think you could actually just read this one story and have a book club on that. And it was so rich. There was so much to it. And it's just so surprising. But the other thing is nice is that each story is very different. And the thing that unites them is that they're all brilliant. It's also interesting because it's not an easy read in a way. You have to think quite fast to keep up with him because his mind is clearly operating on just a different level. Maybe you'd be all right, Sarah, but...
Oh, shut up.
Well, you know, neuroscientist, I mean, I sort of feel, you know, there are different sort of levels that people operate at. Mine is a fairly shambling, kind of low-level, everyday one, you know. But so for me, I felt like this stretched me. It asked something of me. It sort of demanded that I think a bit faster to keep up. And I love that about it. And it feels exhilarating when you're experiencing it. Because he does take you with him. You know, that's the thing. You do feel yourself being sort of lifted. And so that I really loved about it. It's just not quite anything else. And it's sci-fi. I didn't say. They're sort of sci-fi stories. So again, a genre that maybe a lot of people wouldn't necessarily seek out. Maybe it's something that they read when they were younger, but they haven't continued to read sci-fi. And I think this book really opens your eyes to what that genre can do and why it's really interesting. Loved it for book club. Loved it for talking about on the pod. Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. He's written other books since, and this is his first collection. I think Obama was a big fan. I think it was on his summer reading list.
Ah, right, okay. I have seen his name around. I remember you discussing it on your podcast. I think this is the only short story collection I've really heard where people have thought this is a good book for a book club. You know, because short stories are a bit tricky, I think. So that's why I remember you talking about it, because it's unusual for someone to say, like, this would be a great thing for a book club, because short stories are a bit weird to discuss. So, well,
the other one I'd recommend, actually, very briefly, but which this makes me think of, is George Saunders. George Saunders, before he did Lincoln and Bardo, was a short story writer. And his collection, 10th of December, we did once for book club, and that also made an absolutely brilliant book club book. Similarly, just brilliantly written, full of ideas, so fun to discuss, and a really nice introduction to George Saunders if you haven't read him before.
Interesting. I haven't read any George Saunders, actually. Still haven't read Lincoln and the Bardo.
Sarah, you would love that.
Sorry,
Set in a graveyard, incredibly depressing.
I know,
grief.
sorry, letting you down as always.
You know, no, I just think, you know, for you, a treat is in store.
I know, one day. It's one of those books where you're like, yes, I know I must read that one day. You know those books where you're like, yes, of course, you don't have to convince me, I'm aware. So many of those. Especially Booker-related books that was shortlisted. But did it win? I don't remember. It was shortlisted.
It won.
It won, okay. If you miss the moment, you just for the rest of your life, you're like, yes, but now there's another shortlist on Booker. Anyway. My next one is Freshwater by Ikweiki Amizi. Freshwater is about a woman who is living in the US, and she has a condition which would be classified as sort of multiple personality disorder in the US and would be considered something completely different in her parents' culture, which is Nigerian culture. And it is a really, really interesting book. If you've not read any Ikweiki Amizi, these are quite experimental book. They do a lot of really interesting things with the prose and the format and all that kind of thing. And it led to such an interesting discussion about mental health and treatment of mental health and that kind of thing in our book club. And I really, really liked it. It's a very challenging book in a really, really good way. It's, I think, a really, really good book to sort of stretch your book club a little bit if you're looking for something that's like maybe a little bit more literary. I think this is like the perfect book to choose. Also quite short. I think it's also about 150 pages. So have you read it, actually, by the way?
Well, I was going to say, there's someone I follow on Instagram who I think you know as well. He's called Sean the Book Maniac.
Oh, yeah.
And he does a thing where sometimes he'll post the first paragraph of a story or the first paragraph of a book. And he posted the first paragraph of that. And I read it and I was like, oh my goodness, this looks incredible. Like there's just something about the writing I really loved. So that absolutely is on my TBR. Actually, I did know about that one.
Sean also lives in Canada. So there you go.
I thought he lived in Japan.
He just moved about maybe a month ago.
Yeah, because he's very active on YouTube, isn't he? And I love what he does on YouTube. It's brilliant because it's got that classic thing about, he's very frank and honest about what he reads, but incredibly thoughtful and reads like 1,000 books a year as far as I can tell.
Also the most unknown books. Like I think I interviewed him on this podcast. So I'll put the link in the show notes actually, but he's the person that I knew when he was coming on. I was like, I'm not going to know any of these books, and I didn't. I think maybe one of them I'd heard of, but yeah, very, very unknown books. He loves like older books by authors that are out of print and who never really made it, but the books are wonderful, that kind of thing, which is so cool.
There are a lot of things to read in the world, and even with the best will in the world,
it's also stressful, isn't it? Because you're like, oh, I must do that.
That's the thing, but no one has the time to read all of them. No one does. But so it's why I think it is actually just so valuable, this pooling of knowledge and people reading and talking about what they're reading. And collectively then we are able to really get through some stuff, and then the books that someone suddenly, oh my God, this book is incredible, really, guys, have a look at this, is really helpful. Because you're like, oh great, okay, that one is one that I'll try and make time for or whatever.
Totally, yeah.
It's a public service we're all doing, really.
Absolutely, and that's why you should listen and support both of our podcasts. Doing God's work. All right, what's your next one?
I mean, I hate, having to be pinned down to 3.
Okay, don't think that I haven't noticed that you've already mentioned a bonus one. It's like, right, I said max 3.
I know, so hard. When we did this, I just thought it was a really, really good book club book. And I wasn't actually crazy about it. I didn't like it that much when I read it, but I just think it's a brilliant discussion book. And it's called The Memory Police by a Japanese author called Yoko Ogawa. Again, it's fairly out there, I think. It did quite well when it was published, and it was shortlisted for the International Booker, which I think put her on lots of people's radar. She turns out to be really interesting. I think the thing is that it wasn't really socially okay to be a writer, and she had to do it secretly, and so she did. And wrote quietly away by herself, and then one day kind of pulled this novel out of a drawer and got it published, and it turned out to be absolutely brilliant and blew everyone's socks off, and since then I think she's written quite a few things. The Memory Police tells a sort of uneasy story. It's set on an island, and it's slightly fantastical in a way. Things disappear, and at first they're things that almost you feel like you could slightly do without. What are the first things that disappear?
Oh, like things not of note. I think flowers and that kind of thing, sort of aesthetic things start to disappear, and then it's things that are more and more important, and then it becomes things that are key to your identity.
Obviously, this is a sort of kind of completely fantastical idea, but what's lovely in the book is the way it's treated with realism. So logically, it's very coherent, I thought. Things don't just disappear. People forget that they existed, and that's why it works. But there are a few people who can still remember. And in order for this collective society to continue to function, these people are a real threat. So there's this sort of disciplinary body, the memory police, who are going around seeking out people who are the ones who can remember. They are then taken away, it's very sinister, and you don't know what happens to them. And it's just a sort of strange, haunting little book that, again, made for really good discussion, because it's just packed with ideas. It's written in quite a simple way. It's quite a melancholy, I'd say, the mood. Elegiac in a way.
It feels sort of intrinsically Japanese to me. It's got that kind of dreamy feeling, removed feeling, which I really
agree.
like.
Which people might, well, it's interesting, which people might find frustrating. I think that's why I didn't get on with it. I found it a bit sort of remote. But after I finished it, the way it stayed with me, I think, is the thing that really struck me about it. That book has stayed with me and informed my thinking in a way that really surprised me. It kind of crept under my skin in a way that I almost hadn't noticed, and I was really impressed by that. I thought, oh, okay. So again, that's an interesting one, because it's a book where I didn't get on with it so well, but people in my book club thought a lot more of it than I did, and so it made for a really interesting discussion. And I felt like it's a book a bit like throwing a stone into a pool. It's just got really interesting ripples, and it's interesting seeing where they go.
Definitely. I agree. No, it's a good one. Also, I think it's quite, because it's kind of this dystopian book about your identity, it just is a good point. A lot of people have read other kind of big famous dystopian books, so I think if you've got a book club full of readers, people have really interesting discussions comparing it to like Brave New World, of course, and all those kind of books. So, great one. My last one, have you got one more, or was that your last one? That
was 3. I'm only doing 3, Sarah.
Quite. My last one is The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, which is kind of a funny one because I chose it. We had I think the theme was historical fiction or something, and I just sort of chose it like, yeah, whatever, just a classic historical fiction, witches. So to explain what it is about, it's set on a Norwegian island in, I think, the 17th century or something like that. And I actually chose it because Jen, so one of the hosts of this podcast, recommended it and said it would be really good, and I asked her if it would be a good book for a book club, and she said yes. It's about the witch trials, actually. There's witch burning, and there's a preacher comes with his wife, I think, and he's trying to convert everyone, and then there's witchcraft going on, and then there's the tension between this sort of new religion and the witchcraft, all that kind of stuff. And I chose it like, yeah, sure, that kind of theme, read it a million times, classic historical fiction, whatever. And then people absolutely loved it, and the discussion we had, so I was completely wrong, it was really a lesson for me to be like less flippant. People really, really liked it. They had a great discussion, and people were like, oh, I haven't read this kind of thing before. There are themes in the book where people specifically in my book club were saying like, oh, I haven't read this before. And it was kind of a lesson to me to not think that everyone is kind of thinking the same way as me, like, oh, just another one of these historical fictions. I've thought about like 15 of these this year, whatever. But they really, really enjoyed it, and I was like, okay, I have to be less dismissive. Sometimes I can be very dismissive. I think, we hear about so many books, you're like, oh, another one of these, sure. So it was a really good lesson for me to just like take a step back a bit, I guess, and not sort of think about things as this person who consumes so many books and is so aware of like all the books that are coming out and all these themes. So
is that the one where it's like a woman and her head is almost turning into like a wing?
I don't think so. Not that. Oh, sorry, the cover, right?
Yes.
The cover, yes, the cover. I don't remember any sort of morphing of that. No, yes, exactly. It's dark blue.
Yeah, that's how I know it. I've just seen that cover and thought, oh.
So yeah, sorry, Jen, by the way, of course. She doesn't mind, though. I think that's all. Have you got any final thoughts about book clubs? Any final comments you'd like to make?
Final comments about book clubs. I think I have come to appreciate my book club more and more in recent strange years as a way of connecting me with people, as a way of having discussion and debate that feels so important, and yeah, socially, just a reason to get together with people. It feels like everyone is so busy and it's hard to carve out time, and also reading takes a lot of time, and reading is just basically sitting in a room by yourself. And so I love the way that book clubs expand that out and bring it into the real world and change you. The best conversations about books change you slightly, make you revise your opinions. I love it when that happens. I love it when I go and I think one thing and then, 3 people will be like, what? Why do you think that? It's this. Or, sometimes make you see a book differently. I've definitely read books where I thought I had a pretty specific idea about what happened, and then someone else has said, no, it's not that. Don't you see? It's this. And oh.
Totally. Yeah.
So, surprises you and just deepens your engagement with the things that you're reading in a way that's really enjoyable. So what's not to love about book clubs? Start one. If you don't have one, start one tomorrow.
Yeah, I agree. Great way to meet people as well. It's just, I'm exactly the same as you. Some of the people that I've met in my book club have really helped me through some really weird and bizarre things that have happened to me in the last few years. So it's just super valuable, and it's amazing to get this opportunity to discuss things with people that you wouldn't normally do. Like, there's not normally a way for you to sort of randomly start talking about these kind of issues, but through the medium of a book. It's really, really valuable. So I think it's great. And if you're not, if you're not part of one, join one. If you live somewhere where there's not a lot of like in-person book clubs or whatever, do one online. See if you can. I think they're really great.
Hey, you could join my Instagram book club.
Join Grace's Instagram one, yeah. Tomb of Sand, unknown
We're
date.
going to do War and Peace next.
Just start messaging her on Instagram. Speaking of messaging you on Instagram, where can people find Book Club Review podcasts?
They can find us on Instagram at Book Club Review Podcast, on Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or we are online. We have a website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you'll find our archive of over 120 episodes now. Each one lovingly crafted, full of book recommendations, and just sitting there waiting for you.
Yeah, excellent. Love it. I will put all of those in the show notes. And yeah, if you guys have not listened to any of Kate's episodes, please go and listen to Book Club Review. It's a wonderful podcast and you'll enjoy it. I guarantee. Or your money back. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much, Kate. This was really fun. Really interesting to think about book clubs.
Oh, pleasure.
All of our links are in the show notes as well as all of Kate's. But again, you can email us at thebookcastclub@outlook.com. or contact us on social media at Bookcast Club on both Twitter and Instagram. I thank you so much for listening, and we will talk at you again in 2 weeks.
Bye.